Good afternoon, and thanks for coming to another edition of the History Hunter series. Stewart always brings a great audience, so we're happy to see the room full today. Again, thanks for coming out and enjoying the weather. Not a whole lot going on at the museum. We just got done celebrating our 10-year anniversary, and so right now we're just resting up from that and then getting ready for Christmas at the museum, which will start November the 6th. But I would encourage you, if you've not been through the museum recently, today after the presentation, to take some time to tour the museum. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jean.
Well, for 6 years now, the fourth Thursday of every September, you should be here because we've had Stewart here for six years now.
I believe it's actually 5 years, Gene.
Now, you told me that last year.
Okay.
It doesn't make any difference. Just always mark your calendar for this Thursday in September, and he'll be here because we moved him from Delaware to Ohio. So he's getting closer, so it's not such a big drive anymore. So there's nothing else to say except here is our annual speaker, Stewart Rafert.
And I always thank Jean because I worked in the courthouse for years with her on records and in the clerk's office. And one of the most interesting records there were the orphans records back in the 1880s and 90s. The Miami people were not citizens at that time, and they had to have an attorney to represent them. And unfortunately, the attorneys, especially the kids, would lose their property fairly easily that way through extra expenses and things like that. I hope I'm not offending any attorneys here this morning. But it's an interesting story, and I don't know how many times I was in the courthouse digging through old records. And at the same time as I was coming to Wabash, I was also going to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., where they had a huge trove of Miami records there too. So it's the federal records and the courthouse records. And then when I started talking to Miami people, they had their records too of the tribe and what I called an under-the-bed archive, where people would keep documents literally under their bedroom bed, pull them out. That was the safest place, I guess. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is to focus on LaMoine Marks, who was a Wabash person, Wabash County his whole life. He was born here in 1907 and died in February of 1986, 88 years old. And he knew the natural history of this area so well, and was so wonderful in the Miami Indian book because he gave you the background on so many of the old stories, old ways of doing things, whether it's fishing or hunting or a whole bunch of other things. He really enriched the book, and I dedicated the book to him because we were always learning from each other. So I'm going to talk about the relationship with LaMoine Marks. And are there any members of the Marks family here this morning? Any Marks? It's a big family scattered around. He was one of 10 kids of Charlie Marks and Nellie Hinkle, who was a white woman. And LaMoine, he liked his white ancestry too. The Hinkles came up from Virginia, and they brought the blue-tick hounds into Wabash County back in the 1840s, I believe it was, when the county was just getting started. So he had a very interesting genealogy as well. But thoroughly Indian, Miami Indian in his background and thinking. And when he talked about his own genealogy, he could go all the way back into the 1700s or even the late 1600s, going back through generations of people, back to Sandia, the great leader that died in 1815, and way, way back. And his great-grandfather was a brother of Shangamizia. You all heard of Shangamizia, right? And he also had a great-grandmother who was an Indian captive from near Richmond, Indiana, taken in about 1812 or 1813 at that time. And she moved in, was married to a Miami man, and was actually a suicide in, I believe, 1850, jumped off of the cliffs down near the Hog's Back on the Mississippi River. That's a whole other story. So here we are, and the question is, how did I get hooked into this whole thing with the Miami Indians and LaMoine Marks in particular? I put this in just to my wife. She's here this morning. My kids and wife came out to Indiana, and they became Hoosiers whenever we were out here. And on the left is my daughter Kyla, and on the right is Samara. There was Swan Hunter over in Peru at her little house. Swan was a granddaughter of Gabriel Godfroy, and she was the 17th of 18 children in that family. And she was, gosh, what can I say? She had 8 of her own children, and they had many children, and so on. These huge families, Godfroy family. She had nieces and nephews that were younger than older than she was, because of the way the family was stretched out. She said to me, I don't know very much, but she said, go talk to my nephew, who was Oliver Godfroy. This picture's from a postcard, and he is holding up a shield. His name was Swimming Turtle, and he's wearing a peace medal from Andrew Jackson, right there, silver peace medal. He had a couple of those. They're very rare and extremely valuable. But when I visited with Oliver, he was a very politically active person and in the Miami tribe in that sense. And he was clinking these medals together, and he said, these aren't worth anything. I think, what's wrong with this picture? Because I know they're worth thousands of dollars. They're so rare. They're bigger than the silver dollar. And what he meant was the federal government has not honored our treaties. That's all. We've got these nice shiny medals, but the government hasn't honored our treaties. So that was the meaning of that. I got a real nice interview with him just 2 weeks before he died, totally by accident. He seemed totally healthy when I interviewed him over in Peru, and he had a heart attack and just suddenly passed away, just as he won a lawsuit that his Indian treaty land should never have been taxed. It was protected by the treaty, and he won the lawsuit. So that's such a big event. I figured he said, I'll die before this happens, but he lived to see it happen, that his land should not have been taxed, and that was wonderful. So I got passed on. Swan Hunter said, go see my nephew Oliver Godfroy, and I went from Oliver to other people. This is one of his brothers, who some of you know about Miami Indian stories. Clarence Godfroy lived at Rich Valley, very near here, just up the river. And that's his barn, and on the barn he's got his Miami name, Kapapwa, and that means looking over the top, like someone's on guard, or looking just over the top of a hill to see what's coming up. I think that barn might still be there, I'm not sure. Now here's LaMoine Marks, and how did I get to meet him? He was such a wonderful, perfect person to be talking about all these things. I was in the courthouse over in Peru, and a man named Albert Sharp asked me what I was doing. I said, I'm looking for Miami Indian records here. And he said, well, you've got to talk to LaMoine Marks. And he said he's over in Wabash, and he has a taxidermy shop down on Canal Street, back behind Jack Francis's antique shop. So I came over here, and we struck it up right away. And I was again kind of surprised. But the thing we had in common was I grew up on a farm, and I was a squirrel hunter and hunting rabbits and working with farm animals and all that stuff. And he'd been a farmer, and he was a hunter and a fisherman and all those things. And he had such good stories, I decided, well, I'll just listen to him. I don't have anything to tell him, I'll listen to what he says. And we started off that way. And I was very privileged because more than once, someone would come in from somewhere that really wanted to talk to him, and they didn't know enough to listen to him, or they were kind of telling him stuff, and he would very politely say, well, he said, I just don't know what you're asking, and maybe you should talk to someone else. And he wouldn't say who, and they would go off. But I got to talk to him for 16 and a half years. And eventually I said, we're talking, I'm taking all these notes, can I use a tape recorder? And he said, sure. So we started the tape recorder, and then eventually we ended up with a camcorder, and I got films of him too. He's in his shop now, and he's working on a ceramic figure of a deer, which he didn't really have it killed. He baked it somehow, and then he painted it deer colors. We set it out in his yard over on Grand Street by the tire factory. Okay. And his yard was full of figures of animals and birds and all sorts of things that he had put together there. He was very gifted at carving and making things artistically. here he is on his porch swing, and I say Grand Avenue, it's Grand Street over on the west side of town, right next to the old General Tire Factory. We spent many an afternoon sitting outdoors talking. I was filming him on this day, and that's just what he looked like. You can see he's got a serious expression on his face. He's sharing some stories about boxing in this particular interview. We often took field trips all around Wabash County, Miami County, many, many times. We like to be outside. That was my farm boy thing too. I was in the woods all the time, so I thought, wow, this is really good. I can get back to the woods and talk about stuff. The people he remembered were very interesting. They went back very far. On the left is, it says John Bundy there, and it says John Bundy on the slide, but it looks more like Ross Bundy to me, his son. Ross Bundy was fluent in the Miami language, and he died in about 1963. He was one of the last speakers of the language. And on the right is Meshingamezia. That's a photograph that turned up down in Indianapolis and had been known for a long time. I identified it. But LaMoine Marks knew stories of Meshingamezia. He was a great uncle. And we walked around the reservation a lot, and he talked about different spots there that he knew where different things had happened, different graveyards, and so on. These are other people that Marks knew about, and especially the person on the left, Francis Shoemaker, grew up here in Wabash on the east end of town, where there's kind of a little Miami community, or just that way. No, that way. And he said, don't go to Shoemaker because you don't know enough. He's a radical. And I knew what that meant. It meant he was a radical Miami, not in any other way. Shoemaker was a railroad worker on the New York Central here and a whole bunch of other jobs. And the interesting thing, his name in Miami was Papakwa, and that means the flea. And I said, well, how'd you get that name? He said, because I was always jumping around a lot as a kid. Officially, his name was Little Fox, and the Miami name was just for him. It wasn't his public name. That was something different, like Little Fox. The man on the right is Camillus Bundy, or Kim Bundy, and that was Shoemaker's grandfather. And Bundy was a radical Miami person trying to defend treaty and land and so on, and was in the Wabash County jail several times because he would not leave the Francis Silverman Cemetery and stuff like that, claiming it was Miami land. And today the Miami tribe does have a cemetery, and the Godfrey Cemetery are owned and controlled by the tribe. Bundy was a radical, and he died in 1935. And I asked Shoemaker, I said, were you with your grandfather the day he died? And he said, yes, I was. I spent that day with him. And then I asked him a loaded question. I said, did your grandfather know that that's the day he was going to die? He said, oh, yeah. He told me the first thing in the morning. He said, I'm going to die today. And that's a very Indian thing, to know that a certain day is the day that you're going to die. And I don't know these stories. They are typically traditional Indian, and you can question them, but in the Indian community, they make a lot of sense, and they seem, because they're so compellingly real to the people, that it's easy to understand what they're talking about. There were women activists too, and Victoria Brady, or Dooley Brady, is on the left. She was a fiery, passionate Miami nationalist in regard to the treaties, especially the 1854 treaty that I've talked about here before. And she went to Washington, D.C. many times, to the extent that they told her not to go there to the Bureau of Indian Affairs anymore. She was not to come back. She was too resistant. She died in the 1931, but on the right is a woman I got to know. Carmen Ryan was Laura Siders' older half-sister. Laura Siders is fairly well known. I'm sure some of you have heard her name and active in the Miami Nation until her death about 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Anyway, Carmen Ryan was a fiery nationalist, and she's at one of the Miami pageants, Maconaquah pageants, somewhere along the river, Listening Glen Falls or somewhere, and she's dressed up in her Indian outfit, and there's the Ford car in the background. That picture's about 1926 or somewhere in there. To the end of her life, she was a fiery supporter of Miami rights. She found out, for example, the Miamis had treaty awards in the 1960s and 70s. Now, most of you have heard of that, right? The Miami tribal members got some money from treaties that were broken. And she proved that the federal government had turned over this money to a bank in Oklahoma, in Miami, Oklahoma. They were mismanaging the money, and they had squandered a bunch of money the federal government had awarded to the Miami people. And she proved that and took it to Washington. The government had to replace that money. It should never have gone to a private bank. After that, the money was kept at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and the Federal Reserve Bank handled those small amounts of money that went out as treaty awards. So Carmen did that. Carmen also said that there's $64,000 that the federal government's been holding since 1885 or something like that, and the government told Victoria Brady, no, the money has been passed out, blah, blah. They told Carmen Ryan this, and she dug in on it. And when the war came in 1971, guess what? The federal government coughed up the $64,000. So it's that kind of persistence that is legendary among the Miami people, among leaders that really put their lives on the line and have taken risks, and they've spoken truth to power in Washington, D.C., which is really hard to do, and have gotten some things changed. This is a territory that LaMoine Marks and I wandered. I know you can't see that map very well, but it's bounded by Peru on the left, and Wabash is up here on the upper right, and down below is Marion. And the nice marker for that land is the Wabash River on the upper side, when Mississinawa come together just east of Peru, where the old circus quarters was. And I'm telling you, we walked and treaded and trod and explored years in and out and around this territory. And he was up in his 80s, and I was with a guy from Indianapolis at the State Museum, and we couldn't keep up with him walking around. He just stayed that active. But in this territory, he pointed out the cemeteries. We visited those. There was a buffalo wallow. It's the type of thing you wouldn't know about, where the buffaloes wallowed when they were still in this area. And he pointed out buffalo wallow, certain stone formations. He showed where the Massasauga rattlesnakes used to be, and I don't know if there are any more of them around here. There's little bitty rattlesnakes, about 6 or 8 or 10 inches long, miniature rattlesnakes. They used to be common around here in the rocks along the Mississinawa. And on, different things that he would find, and he knew the plants so well. We were eating pawpaws out in the woods, and he said, well, the woods is just a snack bar. Every season there's something you can be eating out here, so it's just nature's snack bar. There's no need to be hungry out in the woods. Just eat off the berries and the plants and the nuts and all that stuff. He was a ginseng hunter too. And one time he said there was a guy walking in the woods out here, and he said the man stepped right on a beautiful ginseng and squashed it. He didn't even know what it was. And he said, and, that's sort of a joke against people being ignorant or not knowing things, which is a position taken from being put down at times and things like that. Well, what do the Indians know? And he was saying, well, what do the white people know? The man just mashed that ginseng in there. So that type of humor went on often. This is the earliest barn of the old circus quarters over in Butler Township, Miami County. And it's a brick building, and I believe he said that was for tigers and lions. But we stopped by to take a look at it, and I think it is a brick building. I think it's still there. Ben Wallace would have had that built. And then Ben Wallace bought the land for the new circus quarters right at just east of Peru from Gabriel Godfrey in 1893. And that was a big deal. And the circuses in 1921 became huge when they merged in the American Circus Corporation and had all new equipment and all sorts of animals and everything. If anybody has a question, just raise your hand, okay? This was a marvelous discovery. This is the summer of 1988, and this is a fishing weir dam, which I'm going to try to point out the ends of it because they're not very clear. The left end is over here, way over here, and it comes across and goes up into a V right here where the fish came through. They had to flow through here, and then it comes over here. And there's some very special rocks here that had holes ground into them and stuff like that. We were driving along River Road on the south side of the Wabash one afternoon, 1988. I don't know if you remember the drought that year was so severe. There was just no rain at all. The Wabash dropped to record low levels. And Moyne, as we always called him, Moyne, not LaMoine, he said there's an old fishing weir dam here where I fished, spear fished in the winter, and my dad fished there, and my dad's dad and on back. And I looked out the window of the car I was driving, and I said, my gosh, there it is. It's right there. I can see it right across the top. And that's when I took this picture. And I called up the Department of Natural Resources in Indianapolis, and I said, there is a magnificent Indian fishing weir dam up here on the Wabash River. Do you have that in your inventory of archaeological sites? And they said, no, we don't know anything about it. And I said, well, it's here, sitting here. And Marks told me about 3 more of these dams, 3 more of them around. This was the best preserved one. And I called up Indianapolis and they didn't know anything about those. And you know why they didn't know about them? They never talked to the Indians. The Miamis knew all about them. They were fishing here in the deep water in the wintertime. When the water was clear and the fish were slow, the water was cold. It was a great spearfishing spot. The Miamis knew all about it. Why didn't the Department of Natural Resources talk to the Indians? Because the Indians weren't educated. They didn't even finish high school. They drank too much. They were angry people, and blah, blah, and blah, blah, and blah, blah. Well, they knew a lot. And all you had to do was listen, and they would share. That was my secret. I'm trying to move ahead here. Okay, cemeteries. We went to all the cemeteries where Miamis were buried and Indians were buried. This is Clayton Cemetery on the left, and Marks is standing just to the right. Have any of you been to Clayton Cemetery? Okay. There's a little Miami section at the very back of the cemetery, and there's a grave there of a woman named Polly Wildcat or Polly Mongoza. And she was interesting. She was about 80-something when she died, and she was the last woman that did not speak any English. She only spoke the Miami language. The women were very conservative. They were the stay-at-home people with the children and midwives and the big families and all that. And the guys were the guys that went out and roamed around and all that stuff. So the women tended to be very conservative, and with the language they were conservative too. They tended to speak the language longer than the men did, and kept some traditions alive that the men didn't. So Polly Mongoza was the last person who did not speak any English, only the Miami language, and she's buried in Clayton Cemetery. On the right side, the Mshingamezia, really it's Mshingamiji, the cemetery is much larger, and there's Coon Bundy's grave, and he died on October 3rd, 1868. He was in his 30s, and how did I know that he died specifically on October 3rd, 1868? Does anybody have an idea of how I would know a specific date like that? Any thoughts? It just said 1868, I think. No, it does. Oh, it doesn't. I'm sorry, it does say October 3rd, but that's not how I got the date. I've spoiled my story, haven't I? I found the date on annuity records in Washington, D.C. The government paid $4 or $5 or $7 a year to all the Indiana Miami. That was further from their treaties. And I found all those records were at the National Archives, and he had the birth and death dates through many years, from 1846 all the way up to 1881. And I got all that information compiled. And that's actually where I found this date. I'm sorry, I blew my story there because it's right on the stone. Thank you, Janice. big thing. I need to go into that a little bit because there's a very powerful and disturbing story behind that. When the Army Corps of Engineers decided in the late 1950s to build the Mississinawa Dam, there were 2 or 3 or 4, there were some tiny graveyards, and then there was the McConaughey or Francis Slocum Cemetery that had to be moved or they'd be underwater. And the Corps of Engineers out of Louisville, Kentucky required Miami people to be there when they went to the graveyards to locate people. And so many Miami people went out, elderly people went out to locate graves, okay? The government then dug up the graves and without any respect whatever for the Miami people, dumped the bones into used Army footlockers and reburied them, where the present-day Francis Slocum Cemetery is a classic example. There are a number of graves there that say number 1, number 29, number 38, no name or anything. This was extremely stressful to the Miami people because their belief is that the ancestors can return and the graveyard is a direct connection to the ancestors. To disturb those graves was the worst thing that could be done. The judges and the people here, and the people who were handling this could not understand the Indian anxiety and terrible upset over this because the cultures were so different. And that became a thing that stirred up a lot of memories and created a great deal of stress in the tribe at that time for many years. One person I know from here in Wabash she had a child that died when she was in her 20s and was buried in the cemetery. And she had to go out and locate that baby, and she said, this is what she told me, that she had a cardboard box, she took the baby's body herself and took it and buried it herself in the new Francis Slocum Cemetery. And believe me, when she told me that story, you could have heard a pin drop. It was a very, very upsetting for her, and it was upsetting for me too, that she took that little remains of that child and herself removed it and reburied the child. So there were various stories and a tremendous amount of upset over that. Now, in the case of LaMoine Marks, his great-great-grandmother that was a captive, and here's how he had it put: Quinquata Hannah Thorpe Dixon, born Lydia Tharp, 1809, taken and raised by the Miamis, married Metukwazah, also known as Captain Dixon, died around 1846. And at the bottom, he's got a memorial given by great-grandson LaMoine Marks in 1996. I knew him when he was planning this memorial, and she is buried in a cemetery, the only Miami in this cemetery. It's south of town, on the east side of 13. Is it 13? It's where the reservoir is very narrow when you cross over. Maybe it's 15. No, it's 13. It's not 15. It's 13. Does anybody know the name of that cemetery? It's a large cemetery. And it's well maintained.
It's just a community cemetery.
It's probably just,
yes.
it could be just a community.
So it's that all of them were combined.
Yeah, well, there were white people's cemeteries, moved to a lot of them through that area. Those little.
My great-great-grandpa was buried, great-great-grandmother was buried at this place where
Okay.
they're at.
Okay, and that's something to think about, isn't it, too, that a lot of white, the small towns, Somerset and so on, they were moved. People got new houses up higher, and all the graveyards were moved and everything. So everybody was affected by this. Did you have any particular feelings about that?
We didn't have any choice.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have any choice about it. My mother and I went out to see them when they dug them up.
Mm-hmm.
And they were in caskets and they had glass coverings on them. They were well preserved. I mean, they had their jewelry, their clothes and everything. Then there was a Fitzpatrick that worked for him, and his beard and hair was red. You could just see it. But they had glass coverings over the caskets. But unfortunately, we heard took that night, did bury him that day and took him out to the cemetery. And you could see people going through the cemetery pilfering all the, they were sending all the caskets to it. So we were told that all of her jewelry and everything was taken, anything was taken off that was valuable.
Any
And
thoughts
then
on
later,
that?
some of the headstones were missing.
Anybody else have a thought on that? That is heavy. That's dark, isn't it? Sad. Well, Jane Bundy, the mother of so many in Miami, because she had 5 husbands and children by all 5 of those husbands, all intermarried throughout the Miami tribe. Her headstone disappeared from the Bundy Cemetery when it was moved, and it turned up in someone's garden about 15 years ago, and they were so kind. They called up the Miami headquarters of Peru, and they said, we have this, and it said, Chinagua on it. We have a gravestone here, and they keep it in their vault, very well protected over in Peru now. But the white person that called up was so kind to say that they had found that and returned it to the Miami tribe. And by the way, Chris Schenkel, who collected a lot of Miami stuff over the year, over Bippus, I think it was Bippus, Indiana, where he lived. Isn't that a funny name? Who knows? Anyway, his widow returned all of that to the Miami Nation over in Peru, and they keep it in the tribal council room. They have some wonderful things over there. My feeling has been, in my own personal case, I don't want Miami things. They belong to the Miami people. And if I find anything that they would need or want, I return it to the tribe. It needs to go the other way. And they're very gratified with that. But aren't these cemetery stories sad and disturbing? My goodness. Well, I got a question now. Where do you think LaMoine Marks, he died in February 1986, where are his remains? Anybody have an idea? He would like me asking this question.
Is it down by Peru?
Yeah, it's down towards Peru.
Over Godfrey? That's not that way.
No, that wouldn't work because of clan thing.
Oh, that's right.
Wouldn't work out. You know, the Godfrey Barbosa Cemetery and the Shigamezi and so on. He was cremated and his remains were scattered in 7 pillars. So if you want to visit LaMoine Marks, and I would really encourage this, and I'm not making this up or being funny about things, go over the 7 pillars. Jim Allison here took some wonderful, wonderful pictures. He has a little drone now that he can fly. A wonderful picture of those 7 pillars. But if you go there and sit on the bank on a sunny day like today and just meditate, you'll catch a little bit of his spirit, I think. He adored the rivers. He lived on the rivers. He was a fisherman and all that. And we sat at the pillars one day years ago, and I started telling an old story. And it was an old Miami story that is not supposed to be told outside the Miami community. And he looked at me, and he was never really angry with me ever, but he looked at me and he was sure grouchy. He said, "Where did you hear that story?" And I said, "Well, I've heard little bits and pieces of it, and I had a dream, and the story just came together, and I just been telling you from my dream the story. It's about deep waters and creatures and birds and so on, transforming." And he said, "Well, okay." That was the end of the story. I could tell a shoemaker story that's okay, though it's along the same lines. He lived on the Eel River, Francis Shoemaker, near Rowan, and I visited him, and he was talking, and he said, he said, "There is an owl in the tree just outside my property here that's talking to me, and I don't know what the owl is trying to say," and he just left it at that. And years later in Oklahoma, we were in a meeting with the Indiana Miami down in Miami, Oklahoma, and he started laughing. I said, "What are you laughing about?" And he said, "I'm laughing about radical and wait until you're ready. And I just independently felt like I gotta call this guy and see what he said. And he said, well, come on up to Rowan. You know, we were living slave at that time. So I came up to Rowan, walked in the door. He was so friendly. And the first day we just talked, and I made a big recording of our talk. And the next day I went back and he said, you know, no tape recorder. We talked about things. And in Oklahoma, I realized also that the owl was his grandfather, Camillus Kim Bundy, was talking. And basically, I even figured out what the conversation was about. Bundy was telling him that I was okay to work with Miami. That's all. So I got the total trust of Francis, and that gave me the total trust of everybody. So it was a wonderful and a little bit daunting in a way to have that kind of inner understanding of things, but he gave it to me. He recognized it. And it's true in all the traditional people, not just Indians, but worldwide. Some people know things, and that's how they hold their communities together. That and a lot of stress and difficulties, and also humor. The Miami humor is, John Stewart can't do it any better. Or I should say Herb Schreiner, or who else? Anyway, great humor, great sense of humor, dry humor, funny humor that catches you off guard and really makes you laugh hard. So all those things go into this Indian, Miami Indian identity. So I think I'm talked out. I've got to take a drink of water, and I'm open to questions or comments. Sir?
May I ask you a question about 1846 removal?
Yes.
I got a call, was an email from Diane Hunter, who I think is with the Miami, Oklahoma, whose office is
Yes.
Yeah, and they have an office now, I believe, in Fort Wayne.
Mm-hmm.
Question might be a little bit too specific, but most of the history of that removal talk about there was 3 canal boats in Miami County, and then 2 additional canal boats in Fort Wayne. And there's some record left as to where they boarded in Peru, but now trying to find where they might have boarded in Allen County. And would it have been White Raccoon's village, or might it be in the landing, or do you even have any idea?
No, it would have been a special collecting spot where the Indians were told to come. If they didn't come, they'd send out militia to find them and drag them over there, put them on the boats. And the government several times came back and got what they called skulkers, people who did not want to be removed. And so it would be a specific spot in Fort Wayne where the government would meet with the Indians there and to pay the annuities and so on. To remember the money, I said they would give out a few dollars to each person every year.
So if we're looking for hints,
Yeah.
would it necessarily have had to be in a reservation
No,
space, or where the annuities were paid? Anywhere, could have been anywhere, is the answer to that question.
Well, there was a government blockhouse, and that's why Fort Wayne became Fort Wayne, because Anthony Wayne and all that. It was Kekionga, and which is a Delaware name, really. It's not Miami. And as in Peru, there was a collecting point that the government picked, and it would have been out in the boondocks. It would have been right in town, right where the canal boats were. Yeah. Yeah, there's one additional thing to say to that. There were Miami removed who should not have been removed, and they simply got back to Indiana, and the government did an investigation. It turned out they were entitled to stay in Indiana, and Congress passed a law in 1850 saying, yes, indeed, they should be allowed to remain here. So the Oklahoma group was much smaller than the Indiana group as the tribe regathered, and as the Eel River, Miami, a few people joined in here and intermarried among the local Miami population. The Indiana membership is always about 3 times what it is in Oklahoma. There is tension between the groups because of treatment of the federal government and all that stuff. Yes?
I have a few questions, but if you want to take a drink of water.
I need a drink. I'll drink water while you ask me a couple of questions.
One time I was out at the Francis Slocum Cemetery when all the foliage was down. And if you're back to the back of the cemetery, if you look across, river, would you say that directly across was where her village was, Deaf Man's Village? Is that the proximity? And would they have just simply, when they dug up the first cemetery, come across the river and located, or would they have went on a road route the first time?
I think the Corps of Engineers would have taken a road route around. And it's true, yes, they are directed north and south.
From the original village?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the original village is not flooded. It is still land that's above water.
It's on the
Even-
beach, right?
It's on the beach, And the base of the original Francis Slocum Monument was still there when we did a documentary that I showed here a few years ago. The base of the monument was still there. The monument's a wonderful zinc monument. You know, it's a big zinc monument to Shipakanak. Or that's what they say, the Miami say Shipakanak or Shipakanak in the new Francis Slocum Cemetery.
And how many people would you say still speak the language fluently, and where are all the relics, like in the pictures with the peace treaties, the medals, are those still, do they still have all these things today?
The medals went to Indianapolis that Oliver Godfrey or Avalon Godfrey had years ago to a museum, and now they're incorporated in the Idle Jorg Museum. And the Idle Jorg Museum has a very nice relationship with the Miami Nation of Indiana. In fact, the Idle Jorg was the first museum in the United States that got the Smithsonian to loan out their objects to an outside museum. And what they got were things like the beautiful Francis Slocum blanket over here with all the ribbon work on it, and many other objects at the Idle Jorg. And the Miami come and go from the Idle Jorg artists and so on to work there. And so it's a very warm and supportive environment for and of course it's very expensive to maintain these items. If Miami were federally recognized and had a culture center up here in Wabash to have those objects, they would work fine, but it takes a lot of money to do that. But that's the story of those peace medals. They are at the Idle Jorg. And by the way, the Idle Jorg has an original St. Mary's Treaty medal from 1795, which are extremely rare. I don't know how they ever found it. It's a silver medal with George Washington on it, and it is gorgeous. And they also have the flag, a flag, when the tribes met at the treaty in 1795, St. Mary's Treaty. There were flags made for each tribe. Well, it turns out that tribal women made the flags. And the only one that survived was the Miami flag. It says Anthony Wayne at the top of it, and it's got an odd number of stars and stripes and all that. It's kind of an imaginary American flag, but it's quite large. It was hidden away in Indianapolis for years. It came from near near Rowan. No, not near Rowan. What's the little town? It's not, Rich Valley. It came from near Rich Valley, that I mentioned. An Eel River, Miami woman had that flag, and it went to a doctor, and he protected it and all that. And she ended up thinking it had been burned or destroyed, but it wasn't. It went to Indianapolis and was kept in an office down there. And then it's been returned to the Idle Jorg Museum, and it's one of the most rare and magnificent objects of its kind in the United States. The Smithsonian did a study of it and everything. It's Indian made. The Indian tan leather on it, the stitch work and all that stuff is Indian made. By the way, question on that flag is called the Wayne flag, 1795.
There's a question about native speakers.
Oh, native speakers, yes, I'm sorry. I really want to follow up on that because of Gabriel Godfrey and other informants, but especially Gabriel Godfrey over in Peru, who was totally fluent in Miami English. Jacob Dunn of Indianapolis collected thousands of Miami words, and they've been worked by linguists at Berkeley, California, University of California, Berkeley, into a study of the Miami, Illinois language. It's just top notch. And the Miami tribe has, this is Oklahoma, Miami in this case, over at Miami University in Ohio, have done a real nice little book of Miami English, English Miami. It's just a little paperback book. It's really charming. It has a story of the language. And as to speakers, the speakers have basically died out with Ross Bundy and other people like Swan Hunter, the new words. Marks new expressions in Miami, but that's not speaking a language. But Darrell Baldwin at Miami University's head of Miami Studies, their program, and he can speak the language. He's a linguist, and he's taught his children. He speaks Miami with his children. So the language is spoken now. It's coming back, and thanks to the Oklahoma Miami tribe, which has federal money and federal recognition, a lot of educational materials have been made for the Miami language. It is a living language, and it's quite extensively known. It's one of the best written up languages of the old Algonquian languages there are. So I hope that answers your question. Such a long answer. You're walking a path in the woods with me. How about some more questions? How are we doing on time?
Did LaMoine have a store right across the street?
Yes, LaMoine had a little.
I remember being in there with it.
Yes, and it said Miami Indian Museum, and he had all his taxidermy stuff up on the back wall. There is really something very nice. Yeah. Yep, he sure did. And when he became elderly, he auctioned off all his stuff. It was all auctioned off. Yeah, beautiful things. He did stone carving, especially this little sunfish here gave me one time. It's hard to see against his red shirt, but he was a good carver, and he did pipes, catalanite or soapstone pipes. The stone comes from the Lakota quarry out in Pipestone, Minnesota, right on the South Dakota border. That's controlled by the Sioux Indians now. Yes?
We have a little information on John Newman, the last Delaware Indian, but I've never really heard you say much about him. Did you ever follow anything about his life?
He was indeed Delaware Indian. He was the oldest Indian in Indiana when he died in the 1930s. And he was married to one of the Meshengomezi Indians down at the reservation. And they had land that they lost. But he was a very noted figure in quotes, in Wabash County because he was so Indian and just so different. Just so different, you know. I don't think much has been written about him. I don't think anyone, like Otho Winger or anyone talked to him to get some stories. Any other questions? You're such a sharp group today, sharper than I am.
Is there any books that are published that tells about the Miami Indian language, what the words mean?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The modern study of languages is so advanced. In fact, the first Miami stories published were published in Ireland in 1801 because someone gathered the stories here and they put them into a folklore magazine in Dublin, Ireland. And what happened was those stories have been retranslated from the original Miami, which exists, retranslated into a really close meaning of the story. There are people who can read these languages. Mike McCafferty at Indiana University knows Miami language backwards and forwards. He's the one who proved that Kekeonga is not a Miami word, it is a Delaware word. Mike, by the way, did a wonderful book on Indian place names of Indiana. It's stories, the rivers, the creeks, the trees, all that stuff. So it's a book about words that tells stories of the Indian words of Indiana. Yes?
Just so in these books, if you know the Indian name, you could find out what those Indian names mean.
Often you can.
What is the name of the books?
The big book is the Miami, Illinois language, but the one I would suggest, if maybe even Mitch, if we could get some copies, it's out of Miami University over in Oxford, Ohio, and it's Darrell Baldwin. I can give you the information, or I can email you, because I'm sure they would be glad to, if we had a few of those, some books here.
We do have a dictionary from the Miami Nation of Peru that they have published, and so we do have that up front, but we will get that other book as well.
Yeah, good. The language is well preserved.
Because the names aren't in that, so I asked about that. And they just said that, it's been so they don't update it as much, so they don't know what the names mean. They have to go to someone else,
Yeah.
I just, more than what they have down
Were you
there.
interested in a particular name?
No, with my grandparents, great-grandparents, and all those on the tombstones, I'd like to know what they mean.
they are often different than what people have been told they meant. Mashingomezia, or properly Mashingomezia, means bur oak, the big old bur oak tree. And Waba means white in the language, so Wabash is white, whatever. Wabashiki, or is the name of the Wabash River in the Miami Nation. But those names all have meanings. Pimoyatama means the sound of something going by, the sound of something going by, and or trees or whatever. I was going to, if you think of a question, that's fine. I just want to say I'm going to do a book signing over here. The Miami is also the one that Elizabeth Clement of Ball State and I did. She's died since. It's called Native Americans. There's a lot of Miami stuff in there too. That she and I wrote up. The Miami Indian Zoo has a lot of pictures in it, and it's a lot of pictures not a lot, but some of the pictures I've used here in that book. Swan Hunter, by the way, had photographs and shared those, and was wonderfully enriching for the book. Ed?
Is there any facts about the Blue Lake region around Churubusco?
I'm sure there are about creatures underwater and stuff.
Creatures and
Yeah.
creatures?
Creatures. Not the Loch Ness monster, but other monsters. That's Indian.
Our son
All the
had-
lakes would have native names and so on. Yeah.
Well, my son and his son, they got around to a place around Blue Lake that was supposed to be the birthplace of, and I don't know which one it was. God brought for, but anyway. And I'm just curious, because the fellow that owned the place caught him on his land and told him to buzz off. But I just wondered if there's anything else around there.
Oh, there would be.
Has to be.
These Indian connections are everywhere.
Churubusco, you know what that is?
No, well, Churubusco is a Spanish from Mexico, the Mexican War, like Jalapa down here, 1846, 47. That's when all these towns were started up, and so they got Mexican names, Buena Vista and so on, Jalapa, Churubusco, and so on. Well, I think we've kind of reached the end here. There are more handouts back there. There's a handout, a biography of LaMoine Marks I wrote for some magazine, I forgot which one, boxing stories, and there's taxidermy stories that are free back there. I want those to go out with you people today who would be interested over the Miami Tribe.
Well, thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you.
So before you leave the room, we have a couple things that we want to share. One, Stewart already touched on, that we do have his books available up front that he will sign, or if you brought your own copy, I believe he'll sign that as well. He did make mention of the Francis Slocum garment. It is scheduled to be rested, and so at the end of October, that will be rested and taken out of the museum's public space for a few months, and that's just something we do to protect the garment. And so if you want to see that or talk to Stewart today about that, this would be the time to do it, as it will be out of the public site for a few months starting in November. And with that, we have one other thing. We were told that maybe someone had a birthday close to today. Are we correct in that?
You are.
Okay, well, we have a surprise. So if I am not a vocal person, but if we can sing happy birthday to Stewart. So
I think Gene did this.
yes, yes. So happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Stewart. Happy birthday to you.
I'm so gratified. I will be 75 years old on Sunday, this Sunday, and there's going to be an eclipse of the moon, the harvest moon, and they say only every 30 or some years is a moon this close to Earth and this magnificent. I'm hoping it's clear, and that evening is going to be a treasure. I'll be back in Columbus with grandchildren and so on. I can't believe that this special moon is on my 75th birthday. I feel so blessed.
Well, thanks again for coming. We appreciate it. Thanks again for coming today. To Stewart's wife, we got 4. Hopefully he'll share one with you. So, but again, enjoy the museum. Enjoy your conversations with Stewart, and the book signing's up by the front desk.
I'm
So,
going right out there this second.
thank you.
Depends on what kind of a cortisol that they're doing.
Okay.
If,
My name is Lucretia L.U.T.
But if you're saying they're tax deductible, then it has to go through the 501c.
It's right out, so don't use
Don't, yeah, only, yeah. Now, if you had someone, let's say you had a business, you say, you want to give $1,000, we want it to be.
You did just right.
What you can do is have them, let's say, write the check to the museum. We would then take the money, and then we can write